There is a particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. I know this because I felt it on a Tuesday in October, standing in room 14 of the Cloverleaf Motor Inn on the edge of Hargrove, Tennessee, a town I had lived in for 43 years, sorting through a suitcase I had packed in 20 minutes, while my husband of 41 years stood in the doorway of our bedroom and watched. Not to help, not to apologize, just to watch. The room smelled like industrial cleaning solution and something beneath it that no amount of cleaning solution ever fully reaches. There was a Bible in the nightstand drawer, a coffee maker on the dresser with a paper cup still wrapped in plastic beside it, and a heating unit under the window that clicked every few minutes like a metronome keeping time for a life I no longer recognized. I sat on the edge of the bedspread a pattern of faded maroon squares that reminded me of nothing, and I looked at my suitcase, open on the floor. Clothes I had grabbed without thinking. My reading glasses. A framed photograph of my granddaughter Maisie that I had taken from the hallway table on my way out, because it was the only thing in that house I was certain belonged to me. And then, I looked at the black garbage bag I had set by the door. The things I had collected from the back of the hall closet in the last minutes before I left. Old scarves, a broken umbrella, and one wool overcoat, dark charcoal gray, soft and worn at the elbows, that had belonged to my father. I had been meaning to donate it for years. I do not know why I grabbed it on my way out. Some instinct, some feeling the way you reach for a thing before your mind has given you the reason. I was going to drop it at the donation bin outside the grocery store in the morning, along with the rest of what was in that bag. It was just an old coat. It was just my father's old coat. I did not know yet what was in the pocket. And if this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Mitchell, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. My name is Eleanor Calloway. Most people have called me Nora for so long that Eleanor feels like someone else's name. Someone formal, someone standing in a receiving line at a church. Nora is who I actually am. 66 years old, former music teacher at Hargrove Elementary, where I taught for 31 years and watched more children than I can count learn to find something in themselves through a melody. I planted marigolds in the fall and pulled them in the spring. I made my grandmother's cornbread from memory every Sunday. I kept a garden journal. I volunteered at the county library on the second and fourth Thursday of every month, helping children select their first chapter books. These are the things I did. They are not small things, but they are also not the kinds of things that make people look at you twice in a room. My father understood that. Joseph Harlan Cooper was a man who fixed automobiles for a living and lived by a set of principles so quiet and consistent that most people mistook them for simplicity. He was not simple, he was clear. There is a difference between those two things that takes most people a lifetime to understand, if they ever do. He died 12 years ago in the spring, on a Saturday morning, while sitting on his back porch with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. The doctor said it was peaceful. I choose to believe that. He was 78 years old, and he had lived every one of those years exactly as he intended, which is more than most people can say. Before he died, he said something to me that I have carried since. We were sitting in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he had sat across from me every morning of my childhood, the same yellow curtains my mother had hung in 1974. And he looked at me in the particular way he had of looking at people when he was about to say something that mattered. "Nora," he said, "the thing about keeping quiet is you have to make sure you're keeping quiet on purpose, not because you don't know what to say. On purpose." I told him I understood. I thought I did, at the time. I understand it better now. He had a coat, the charcoal gray wool one. He wore it every winter for as long as I can remember, to church, to my school concerts, to the garage on cold mornings when the metal was too cold to touch without something between your hands and the world. After he passed, I couldn't give it away. It sat at the back of my hall closet for 12 years, behind the winter things I actually wore, sun in a dry cleaning bag he had never bothered to remove. That is the coat that was sitting in a garbage bag in room 14 of the Cloverleaf Motor Inn on a Tuesday in October. But to understand what was in its pocket, you have to understand how I came to be in that room. And to understand that, you have to understand Robert. Robert Calloway was a handsome man. I do not say that neutrally. I say it the way you say a fact about the weather. Something true and not particularly important, but worth noting because it shaped so much of what came after. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that went silver at the temples in his early 40s, in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. He had a laugh that filled a room. He had the kind of confidence that does not need to announce itself because the room already arranged itself around him. I met him when I was 24 years old at a summer party in a backyard in Hargrove, and I thought, here is a man who knows exactly who he is. I married him 9 months later, which my father received with a smile that in hindsight, I understand, contained more information than I extracted at the time. Robert built a real estate development company from a small property management firm he inherited from his uncle. By the time our son Kevin was in high school, Callaway Development had become the largest real estate firm in 3 counties. Robert had his name on buildings, on roads, on a conference room at the university where he had endowed a scholarship. He spoke at Chamber of Commerce dinners. He was quoted in the regional paper. He shook hands at ribbon cuttings with the ease of a man who had been preparing for ribbon cuttings his whole life. I stood beside him at those events in the correct dress and said the correct things and smiled the correct smile. I was good at it. I had been doing it for long enough that it no longer required effort. What required effort, quietly, increasingly, and for longer than I have told anyone, was everything else. Robert's confidence, the kind that filled rooms, had another quality I had not understood when I was 24. It did not share space easily. Over the years, it had come to occupy every room of our marriage, the way water fills a container, completely, without awareness of what it might be displacing. He did not ask my opinion on decisions that affected both our lives. He explained them after they had already been made. He did not introduce me at business dinners as his wife who had her own professional life. He introduced me as my Nora, which sounded warm and functioned as a category. He forgot, or did not notice, which is its own kind of forgetting, that I had a life that existed outside the frame of his, that I had students who had grown up and come back to tell me things, that I had a friendship with my colleague Dorothy that was 30 years old and funnier and more sustaining than anything in his social calendar, that I kept a garden journal with notes going back to 1989, and that I could tell you from memory what the tomatoes were doing in the raised beds every July for 3 decades. These things did not interest him. They did not interest him the way a man in a large room is not interested in what is happening in the hallway. I told myself this was simply the shape of our marriage, that all long marriages had a shape, and ours was just this particular one. I told myself this for more years than I should have, which is a thing many women my age have in common, and which I say not as an excuse but as a fact about how quietly these things happen when you are in the middle of them. The changes, when they came, were not sudden. They never are. Dean Proctor was 39 years old when she came to work at Callaway Development as the Director of Client Relations. I know this because Robert mentioned it at dinner one evening with the particular offhandedness of someone who has decided in advance that a piece of information is not worth being careful about. "Hired a new director," he said. "She's sharp. Came from a firm in Nashville. You'd like her." I did not meet Diane for 4 months. When I did, at the company's annual fall reception, held at the Hargrove Country Club, she shook my hand with the kind of warmth that costs nothing because it has been deployed so many times it has become automatic. She had auburn hair and wore a cream-colored blazer and called me Mrs. Calloway in a way that managed to suggest, ever so slightly, that the name was a technicality. I noticed things that evening. I noticed the way Robert's posture changed when she entered a conversation. The way his laugh, which normally needed a full room, required only her presence. The way she spoke with authority about decisions at the company, and Robert looked at her while she spoke the way men look at something they consider theirs. I noticed. I said nothing. I went home and made tea, and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what I had noticed for a long time before I went to bed. That was 14 months before Robert asked me to leave. Glenavon had worked at his father's company since he was 26. He was 40 years old now, and he had his father's confidence, the room-filling kind, but not yet the decades that teach you what to do with it. He was not a cruel son. I want to be clear about that. He was a distracted one, which can look very similar from where a mother stands. His wife, Patrice, she had come into the family 7 years earlier from a family in Knoxville that had money the way some families have furniture. Everywhere. Unremarkable. Simply part of the atmosphere. She was precise and polished, and organized in the way that people who have never been truly uncertain tend to be. She loved her daughter Maisie. I believe that genuinely. And she was not unkind to me in the large, dramatic ways people use to define unkindness. She was unkind in the small domestic ways that are harder to point to and easier to dismiss. At Christmas dinners, which we held at Kevin and Patrice's house 3 years running, my dish, the sweet potato casserole my mother made, and her mother before her, xiao, which Robert had eaten every Christmas of our marriage and requested by name, was placed at the end of the table where it was never quite reached. A new dish appeared at the center, something from a cooking show, plated with intention, spoken about with the enthusiasm that signals that a thing has been planned to be spoken about. The cornbread, Patrice said one Thanksgiving, looking at the cast-iron skillet I had brought covered in foil. You made it the old way. That's so sweet. The old way. The way my grandmother taught my mother. The way my mother taught me. The way I had been making it for 40 years in that kitchen and every kitchen before it. I said thank you and set it beside the store-bought rolls. At Kevin's birthday dinner 2 years ago, Patrice arranged the seating. I found myself at the far end of the table, Bertie beside a business associate of Robert's, whose name I did not catch, separated from Maisie by 6 chairs and 2 conversations I had no part of. From where I sat, I could see Robert at the other end, holding court, and I could see the empty chair beside him where I might naturally have been expected to sit, occupied by Diane Proctor, who had, in the preceding months, moved from Robert's professional life into his personal one with a smoothness that suggested the boundary had never been particularly solid to begin with. No one commented on the seating arrangement. Not Kevin, not Robert. Only Maisie, who was 9 years old at the time, looked down the table at me with the direct, unfiltered perception of a child and said, in a voice clear enough to carry, "Grandma Nora, why are you way down there?" I told her I was fine where I was. She did not look like she believed me. At 9 years old, Maisie had already developed a very accurate reading of the gap between what adults say and what they mean. There is a thing that happens slowly in a long marriage when one person decides, without ever saying it plainly, that the other person has become inconvenient. It is not one event. It is a reorientation, gradual, nearly imperceptible from inside, perfectly visible from anywhere else, in which the space a person occupies in their own life begins to contract. My opinions were heard less, or rather, they were received with a particular expression Robert had developed, a slight nod, a quick, right, sure, that indicated they had been received, categorized as non-actionable, and filed away. Company decisions that affected the accounts we shared were explained to me after the fact. Dinner plans were made, and I was informed of them. Vacations were proposed by Robert and agreed to by me, because that was the order of things, had been for so long that I had stopped noticing the order. I taught music to 3rd graders for 31 years. I know what it is to see a child stop raising their hand. I know the quiet process by which a person decides it is no longer worth offering. I watched it happen to my students, and I helped them find their way back to their own voices. I watched it happen to myself, and I did what women of my generation were taught to do with such things. I kept going. I tended the garden. I made the cornbread. I went to the library on the second and fourth Thursday. I met Dorothy for lunch on Fridays, and we talked for 2 hours about everything, and those lunches were the truest version of my week, the part that felt like me. Dorothy was 69 years old and had been married twice, and had 4 grandchildren and a laugh that could be heard from the next table over. And she had known me long enough to see the things I was not saying, and kind enough to let me not say them until I was ready. The morning Robert told me he was filing for divorce, Dorothy was the first person I called. I sat in my car in the driveway because I did not want to go back inside the house, and I did not yet know where else to go. And I called her number, and when she answered, I said, "He's leaving." A pause. "Where are you?" she said. "The driveway." "Stay there." "I'm coming." That is what 40 years of genuine friendship looks like. Not advice, not told you so, just, "Stay there, I'm coming." The divorce papers, Robert explained with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this explanation, were already with the lawyers. The house was in his name. Had been since we refinanced in 2007, and I signed where he told me to sign, because I trusted him, and because the mortgage person was waiting, and because Kevin was calling from college about something, and because 41 years of marriage had trained me to understand that Robert's decisions were the ones that required engagement, and mine were the ones that could wait. The investment accounts were in his name. The company accounts, naturally, were in his name. "There will be a settlement," he said, the word settlement in the tone of a man discussing a minor logistics question. "We'll make sure you're comfortable," he said. The word comfortable in the tone of someone planning to leave a tip. "Diane and I," he said, and kept talking. But I stopped hearing at that point because there is a threshold beyond which additional information cannot be processed in real time, and I had reached it. Kevin was present for this conversation. He stood near the kitchen doorway, with his hands in his pockets, and a look on his face that I recognized from when he was 11 years old, and had broken something and was hoping the situation would resolve itself without requiring him to speak. He did not speak. He studied a point on the floor approximately 6 inches in front of his left shoe, and he waited for the conversation to end. Patrice was not present. Patrice had, in the previous weeks, been present for a series of conversations with Robert and Kevin about next steps that I had not been invited to. I knew this because I found a notepad in the kitchen with the words "transition timeline" written at the top in Patrice's handwriting, followed by a list of dates, the last of which was the previous Tuesday, which was also the date Robert had asked me to arrange a time to talk. Transition timeline. As if my departure from my own marriage were a construction project requiring scheduling. I left the house that evening with 1 suitcase and the garbage bag from the back of the closet. Robert did not offer to help me carry them to my car. Kevin watched from the doorway of the kitchen. And neither of them said anything as I walked down the front steps of the house where I had lived for 38 years. The roses I had planted along the front walk were still blooming. It was October, and they were still blooming, because I had tended them with enough care that they had learned to last longer than they were supposed to. I got in my car. I drove to the Cloverleaf Motor Inn. I booked room 14 with a credit card that I knew, from a conversation I had overheard 3 days prior, between Robert and his attorney. On a phone call Robert had not realized I could hear. Had a week left before it would be closed, as part of the asset restructuring that had apparently been in planning for considerably longer than the conversation I had been invited to. A week. I had a week. I sat on the edge of the bed in room 14 and looked at my suitcase and looked at the garbage bag by the door and thought about the roses still blooming in the yard. And then I looked at the garbage bag again, and I thought about the coat. I don't know what made me reach for it. 12 years it had been in that closet. 12 years since my father died and left me with, among other things, the sense, never named, never quite articulated, that there was something I was supposed to be paying attention to. Something he had trusted me to understand. The coat was at the bottom of the bag. I pulled it out. It was still in the dry cleaning bag, the plastic one he had never removed, which had done its job of protecting the wool through 12 years at the back of a hall closet. I unzipped the plastic and took the coat out and held it. The wool was the same. The elbows were the same. It smelled faintly of cedar and something underneath the cedar that I cannot name, but that I will always know. I was going to fold it. I was going to put it in a donation pile for the morning. I was going to let it go the way you let things go when your life has just been rearranged without your consent, and you need to make room for what comes next. My hand found the inner breast pocket before I had decided to look there. There was something inside it. I reached in slowly. My fingers found paper first. Old paper, the kind that has taken on the texture of fabric from years of being folded and unfolded. And beneath the paper, something harder. Something flat and rectangular, the size and weight of a card. I pulled it out. The paper was a folded note, 2 inches square, in my father's handwriting. Not his formal handwriting, the careful block letters he used for important things, but his everyday hand, the quick slanted cursive he used for grocery lists and reminders to himself. 8 words. For Nora, the card. When the time is right. And the card. It was old. Older than I expected. The plastic was matte, in the way that plastic becomes after years of stillness, not scratched or worn, simply settled into itself. No logo on the front, no bank name, just a pale silver surface with my name printed on it in small, precise letters. Not Nora, not Eleanor Calloway, Eleanor Marie Cooper. My maiden name. I sat there in room 14 with my father's coat across my lap and this card in my hands, and the heating unit clicked its metronome beat. And outside on the highway, a truck passed going somewhere. And I thought about what my father had said in his kitchen with the yellow curtains. The thing about keeping quiet is you have to make sure you're keeping quiet on purpose. Not because you don't know what to say. On purpose. He had been keeping quiet on purpose. The question, the only question, was what he had been keeping quiet about. I held the card for a long time. I set it on the nightstand beside the wrapped paper cup, and the motel Bible, and the photograph of Maisie that was the only thing in that room that was entirely, unambiguously, mine. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the heating unit and tried to remember everything my father had ever said to me about money, about preparation, about the things a person does quietly for the people they love. He had said very little, but he had said, use this when the time is right. And in room 14 of the Cloverleaf Motor Inn, with 1 week left on my credit card and 41 years of marriage reduced to a suitcase and a donation bag, the time felt right. In the morning, I did not drop the bag at the donation bin. I got dressed. The same clothes I had worn the day before, because I had not thought clearly enough while packing to bring more than one full change. And I looked in the mirror and straightened my collar and pinned back my hair the way I always wore it, because dignity is not a condition you wait to feel before you practice it. Dignity is a practice. My father knew that. My mother knew that. I had spent the night reminding myself. Then I picked up the card and put it in my purse and walked out of room 14 into the cool October morning and drove toward the center of Hargrove. I was going to find out what Eleanor Marie Cooper owned. The First National Bank of Hargrove was a building I had driven past 10,000 times without ever going inside. Robert did our banking. He had always done our banking. This is the kind of sentence that sounds perfectly ordinary if you grew up in a certain era of marriage, in a certain kind of household, and which sounds like something else entirely when you say it out loud to a person who is looking at you carefully and waiting for you to hear what you are actually saying. I had never opened a personal account. I had never held a card in my own name. So I had a supplementary card on Robert's account and a name on a joint checking account that had, to the best of my knowledge, at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, already been flagged for restructuring by the attorney Robert had retained 6 weeks before he told me he was filing for divorce. I drove to First National because it was the largest bank in Hargrove and because I did not know where else to start. I parked in the lot. I sat in the car for approximately 4 minutes and looked at the front doors. My father used to say that the hardest part of any job was not the work itself. It was the moment before you began, when you were still standing outside of it, and the size of the thing was bigger than your sense of yourself. You walk toward it anyway, he said. That is the whole of courage. It is not the absence of the size. It is the walking. I got out of the car and walked toward the doors. The young man at the front desk had the pleasant, practiced expression of someone trained to make all customers feel equally welcomed without yet knowing which ones required particular attention. He smiled when I approached. He said good morning. He asked how he could help. I set the card on the counter between us. I said, I need to check the balance on this account. He picked it up. His expression did the small, specific thing that expressions do when a piece of information arrives that does not fit the category it was placed in. He looked at the card. He turned it over. He looked at the front again. Where did you get this, ma'am? My father left it to me. He nodded slowly. Dad, the nod of someone buying time while they figure out the correct procedure. One moment. He picked up the phone on his desk and spoke quietly into it. Then he looked back at me. Someone from our private accounts division will be right with you. Can I ask your name? Eleanor Cooper, I said. It came out easier than I expected. Eleanor Cooper. My own name, the one I was born with, the one that had been replaced so seamlessly over 41 years that saying it felt like finding something in a coat pocket I had forgotten I owned. A door to the right of the main floor opened. A woman came through it, mid-50s, dark suit, silver earrings, the kind of unhurried walk that speaks to a professional life spent managing situations that required a certain quality of calm. She extended her hand. Mrs. Cooper, I'm Vivian Marsh, SALT Head of Private Banking. Would you come with me, please? Private Banking. I followed her through the door and down a short carpeted hallway into an office that was considerably quieter than the lobby, the kind of quiet that costs something. She closed the door. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. I sat. She sat and she took the card, and she held it for a moment in the way that people hold things when they are processing information before they speak. She looked at the name. She looked at me. When did your father pass, Mrs. Cooper? 12 years ago. She nodded. She turned to her computer and typed something. She waited. She typed again. The expression on her face went through several careful adjustments, the kind of adjustments a professional makes when they are determining what can be said, and how, and in what order. She turned the screen toward me slightly, not all the way, a partial reveal. This account was established 31 years ago, she said, under the name Joseph Harlan Cooper, with Eleanor Marie Cooper designated as the sole beneficiary and account holder upon his death. She paused. It appears our institution received notification of Mr. Cooper's passing 12 years ago, and the account transferred to your name at that time. Another pause. It has remained in your name since. I didn't know, I said. I understand. She said it without judgment. She had, I suspected, heard things in this office that covered the full range of human circumstance. There are some things I'd like to walk you through. If you're ready. Yes. She turned the screen all the way toward me. I want to tell you that I was composed when I saw the number. I want to tell you that I looked at it with the steadiness of someone who had expected, on some level, to find something there. I want to tell you that my father's voice in my memory, on purpose, Nora, on purpose, had prepared me for the size of what I was looking at. It had not. The account balance was not a number I had ever held in my mind in relation to myself. The zeros assembled on that screen were more than I had made in 31 years of teaching, more than our house was worth. More, I would later understand, than the settlement Robert's attorney had been planning to offer me with the word comfortable that I now realized had been chosen specifically because it was a word that did not require a number attached to it. My hands were flat on my thighs. I pressed them down to keep them still. There must be some mistake, I said. There is no mistake. Vivian Marsh said this gently, but without uncertainty. Your father was a careful man, Mrs. Cooper. He worked with our private banking division for over 25 years. This account was established with an initial deposit, invested immediately into a portfolio of instruments he selected with considerable deliberation, and he revisited the portfolio every 3 years. He never withdrew a dollar. She looked at me steadily. In 31 years, this account has grown substantially. The principal, plus compound growth, plus several investments that performed beyond initial projections. She let a moment pass. Your father was not a wealthy man in the visible sense, but he was a very patient one. My father, the man with oil on his hands and grease on his boots and eyes that were always kind. The man who fixed old trucks and tractors and sat on his porch in the evenings and looked at the sunset with the contentment of someone who had made a quiet peace with the world. He had been doing something all those years that no one knew about. He had been building something in the dark and the silence, one careful decision at a time, for 31 years, for me. He left something else, Vivian said. She reached into a folder on her desk. I noticed she had come prepared, which meant the account had a flag on it, which meant some part of this institution had been waiting for me to walk through that door. She slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Standard business envelope, white, my father's handwriting on the front. For Nora, when you need it. The same 6 words as the note in his coat pocket. The same handwriting, his. We were instructed to deliver this upon your claiming the account, Vivian said. I'll give you a few minutes. She stood quietly and stepped out and closed the door behind her. I held the envelope for a long moment. Outside the closed door, I could hear the muffled sounds of the bank going about its morning. Someone laughing, a phone ringing and being answered. The ordinary sounds of a world that did not yet know what was in this envelope. I opened it. His handwriting was unchanged from every grocery list, every reminder note, every birthday card he had ever written me. It was my father's hand. It was the most familiar thing in the room. Nora, if you are reading this, I hope it means things have come right, and you needed something to help you start over. Or I hope it means you're simply being careful, which I always liked about you even when you thought I wasn't watching. The money in that account is yours. It was always yours. I set it aside from work I did in the years before you left home, and I added to it when I could. And I let it grow because I believed in patience, and I believed in you. There is one other thing you should know. Over the years, through the investment portfolio, a portion of the account came to hold shares in a real estate development group based in Hargrove. The group acquired properties throughout the region. I didn't know much about the business specifically. I made the investment based on the growth projections, which were correct. The bank will have the full details. I want you to look at the holdings document before you leave. Your mother always said you were the strongest one in the room when the room stopped paying attention. I believed her. I hope you believe it too. All my love, Dad. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in my purse. Then I sat with my hands in my lap in the quiet office and breathed. The investment portfolio. The real estate development group based in Hargrove. I knew, with a certainty that arrived before I had fully reasoned my way to it, what the holdings document was going to say. I knew because of the particular way that some truths settle into you, not like news, but like recognition. Like something you have been carrying without knowing the shape of it, finally showing you its edges. I pressed the small button on Vivian Marsh's desk. She returned promptly. He mentioned a holdings document, I said. Yes. She sat back down and opened the folder fully this time. I want to walk you through this carefully. She pulled out a printed sheet, clean formatting, 3 columns. She turned it so I could read it alongside her. Your father's portfolio, through compounding and reinvestment, came to hold positions in several regional entities. One of them, she indicated a line near the top, is a real estate development company that has grown significantly over the last 15 years. I looked at the name on the line, Callaway Development Group. There it was, the name on buildings, on roads, on the conference room at the university, the name my husband had put on everything he built, including, I now understood, on a company that my father had been quietly, patiently, unknowingly invested in for long enough that the mathematics of compound interest had made something extraordinary out of something ordinary. "What percentage?" I said. My voice was level. I was grateful for that. Vivian looked at the column. "Through the investment vehicle your father established, the holdings currently represent a significant minority stake." She paused. 11% of Callaway Development Group. 11%. Not a majority, not control, but 11% of a company Robert had built over 30 years into the largest real estate firm in 3 counties was not nothing. 11%, if you wanted to be noticed, was more than enough to be noticed. "He didn't know," I said. It was not a question. I knew Robert. I knew that if he had known my father held any stake in his company, it would have been addressed. Robert managed every variable in his professional life with the attention of a man who had decided that surprise was a condition only experienced by the unprepared. "The investment is held through a trust structure," Vivian said. "Your father was advised to structure it that way for tax purposes. The beneficial owner, your father, and now you, would not appear in a standard shareholder search." She looked at me carefully. "Mr. Callaway would have no reason to know. He had built his empire. For 30 years, he had shaken hands at ribbon cuttings and spoken at Chamber of Commerce dinners, and introduced me as my Nora, with the warmth of a man who owns what he names. And my father, in his quiet way, with his oil-stained hands and his patient eyes, had been sitting in 11% of it the entire time." I thanked Vivian Marsh. I accepted the temporary card she prepared, the one that gave me access to the account in my name. I accepted the full holdings document she printed for me, which I folded and placed in my purse beside my father's letter. I stood and I shook her hand, and I walked out through the private banking door and through the lobby and out into the October morning. I sat in my car. I did not start it. If you or this story is already finding you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Sarah Mitchell. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. I called Dorothy from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring. Sai, which was always how she answered. The first ring she used to decide whether she was in the middle of something, the second to establish that she had decided she was not. "Nora, I need to talk to you, not on the phone." A pause. "The diner on Milford, 20 minutes. That was Dorothy. No unnecessary questions. Just where and when. She was already in the corner booth when I arrived. Coffee ordered, menus pushed to the side. She took one look at my face and said nothing, which was the correct thing. She waited. I told her. Everything. The coat, the card, the note, the number, the letter, the holdings document. I laid it all out in order, the way my father had always taught me to think through a problem. Start at the beginning, move forward. Don't skip to the ending before you understand the middle. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which she was not always good at, which meant she understood that this was a morning requiring an exception. When I finished, she set down her coffee cup. "Your father," she said finally. "Yes." "That quiet man who fixed trucks." "Yes." She shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the particular appreciation of someone witnessing a long game being completed. "I always liked him," she said. "He reminded me of someone who's already won a hand but isn't going to show his cards until the other players have committed." That was exactly right. That was my father, exactly. "What are you going to do?" she asked. It was the question I had been sitting with since the bank. The account gave me options I had not had yesterday morning. The settlement Robert's attorney had been preparing. The word comfortable attached to a number I had not yet seen, but which I could now contextualize against what I actually held, was a different kind of conversation than the one they were planning to have. But the 11% was a different matter. That was not simply my security. That was a fact about Robert's company that he did not know, and that fact changed the shape of several things he believed to be settled. Not yet, I said. I need to understand the full picture before I do anything. Dorothy nodded. She had the patience of someone who had watched me make careful decisions for 30 years and knew what it looked like. And Kevin? She said. Kevin. My son, who had stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and studied the floor while his father told me to leave. Hi, my son, who had not called me in the 8 days since I left, who had not asked where I was staying, who had not sent a text, a letter, a single word. I don't know yet, I said. Maisie? Dorothy said. I thought of my granddaughter, 10 years old, brown-eyed, with her mother's cheekbones and her father's stubbornness, and something of my father, in the way she looked at things directly and said what she saw without performing either politeness or cruelty. Just. What is true? Grandma Nora, why are you way down there? Maisie will find me, I said. She always does. The settlement offer came through the mail to my motel room. Robert's attorney had found the address through Kevin, who had either provided it willingly or been asked and not refused, which amounted to the same thing, on the 11th day. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it. Comfortable. That was the word, and now I saw the number attached to it. A monthly stipend, a one-time payment, a buyout figure for my interest in marital assets, a phrase that had been assembled by a lawyer to sound thorough while accomplishing the opposite. It was not nothing. It was less than nothing relative to what I now knew. I called the attorney's office and told them I would need time to review it with my own counsel. My own counsel. I had said the words before I had a person to attach them to, which was the kind of speaking something into existence that requires a certain quality of nerve. But I had the account. I had options I had not had 12 days ago, and options, my father had once told me, are not the same as decisions. His options are what give you the room to make the decision that is actually right, instead of the one that is simply available. I found my attorney through Vivian Marsh, who offered the name with the quiet efficiency of someone who had provided exactly this kind of referral before. Margaret Elaine Foster, Hargrove, Family Law and Estate Matters, 30 years of practice. She had an office on the second floor of a building on Clement Street that smelled like old wood and was filled with the particular quiet of a place where serious things had been said and handled for a very long time. She read the settlement offer. She looked at the holdings document. She read my father's letter, which I had brought because she asked me to bring everything relevant. When she finished, she folded her hands on the desk and looked at me in the way of someone who has understood the full picture and is now deciding which part to address first. Your husband's attorney prepared this settlement, she said, without knowing about the account or the trust holdings. Yes. And your husband doesn't know about the trust holdings. No? She nodded slowly. Then what has been presented to you as a final offer is actually an opening position based on incomplete information. A pause. Significantly incomplete. Yes. She studied me for a moment. Mrs. Cooper, I'll use your name if that's all right. What is your goal here? I want to understand what you're trying to achieve before we discuss strategy. People come in with different answers to that question. I thought about it. Not the quick answer, the settled one. I want what I'm owed, I said. Not more, not less. 41 years of marriage and a house I lived in for 38 of them, and accounts that exist because of decisions I enabled whether or not my name was on them. That is what I want. She listened. And I want my granddaughter to be able to find me, I said. I want to be somewhere real. Somewhere she can come when she needs to. Margaret Foster nodded. Something in her expression, not softness exactly, but recognition, shifted slightly. All right, she said. Then we have work to do. And I want to be clear with you. The information in this holdings document gives us significant leverage in the divorce proceedings. But leverage is only as useful as the judgment applied to it. I understand that. We won't use it carelessly, she said. But we will use it completely. I liked her immediately and without reservation. I stayed at the Cloverleaf Motor Inn for 3 weeks while Margaret Foster began the preliminary work. 3 weeks is long enough for a place to become a kind of home, or at least a kind of routine, which is different from home but is its own useful thing. I learned which of the parking lot lights flickered and which held steady. I learned that the coffee at the gas station 2 blocks over was considerably better than the motel's paper cups. I learned that if I walked the 4 blocks to the small park on Alderman Street in the early morning, before the commuter traffic thickened, so I could sit on the bench near the fountain for 45 minutes and watch the day come up over the roofline and think clearly about the things that needed thinking. On those mornings, I wore my father's coat. October had deepened into the proper cold of a Tennessee autumn, and the wool was exactly what October required, and I told myself it was practical, which it was. I also told myself it was something else, which it also was. Dorothy came twice a week. She brought pastries from the good bakery on Fern Street, and we sat in the small room with the faded bedspread and drank coffee from the gas station cups and talked, and those mornings were what the motel room had, instead of the garden or the library or any of the other textures of my actual life. They were enough. Dorothy had a gift for being exactly enough. Kevin called on the 18th day. Not in the morning, in the evening, 9:15, a time that suggested he had been working up to it since considerably earlier and had only now passed the threshold required to dial. Mom! His voice had the particular quality of a man who had prepared an opening, and then, upon hearing the other person's voice, lost confidence in it. Kevin? Silence. The kind that is full of things rather than empty of them. Are you okay? He said finally. I mean, where are you staying? Are you? I'm fine, I said. I have a place to stay and enough to live on. More silence. I should have called, he said. Yes. I should have. He stopped. Started again. I didn't handle it right. When Dad talked to you, I should have said something. It was not an apology. It was the shape of one, the outline. Oh, the correct number of words in approximately the correct order. What it lacked was the thing that made it real. The accounting. The willingness to say not just I should have done differently, but what I did instead. And what that cost you. That part was not there yet. But he had called. And calling, at 9:15 on the 18th day, after 18 days of silence, was not nothing. It was the beginning of something, which is different from the thing itself, but is also necessary for the thing to exist. I hear you, I said. Not it's fine. Not don't worry about it. 2 words that acknowledged, without absolving. My father would have approved of the economy. Maisie asks about you, Kevin said. There was something in his voice when he said this. Not strategy, not manipulation. Just a fact he was offering as a bridge. I, the only one he currently had available. Tell her to call me, I said. She has my number. After we hung up, I sat in the small room and thought about what Kevin's call meant and what it did not mean. It meant he was uncomfortable with what had happened. It did not mean he fully understood his part in it. It meant he was testing the ground. It did not mean he was ready to stand on it. Understanding the difference between those things was something I was still learning to do in real time, without the habit of 41 years of marriage that had trained me to close the gap between what was offered and what was actually the case. Maisie called the next morning at 7:45. She was on her way to school. I could tell because I could hear a car in the background and the particular muffled quality of a phone being held in a way a 10-year-old holds a phone, close and full of intention. Grandma Nora! Maisie girl! Where are you? A motel on the edge of town. Just for a little while. Which one? The Cloverleaf on Route 9. I know that one. We drove past it. There's a sign out front that has a picture of a 4-leaf clover. A pause. It only has 3 leaves in the picture. I always thought that was funny. I laughed. Genuinely, the way laughter comes when you're not expecting it. You're right. I hadn't noticed. Dad said you and Grandpa are getting a divorce. Her voice was careful around the word, the way children are careful around words they know to carry weight. Yes. Are you sad? The directness. No preamble. She's no softening. Just, are you sad? It was the question my father would have asked. The question that wanted an honest answer, because it was asked by someone who could actually hear one. Sometimes, I said, and sometimes I feel something else. What else? I thought about the bank, and the card, and the coat, and the morning walks in the park in my father's wool. About Margaret Foster, with her folded hands, and her 30 years of serious rooms. About the holdings document in my purse, and 11% of a company built on the belief that I was worth the word comfortable. Like I know something I didn't know before, I said, like the picture got bigger. A pause. 10-year-old Maisie processing this. That sounds good, she said. I think. Grandma? Yes? Can I come see you? At the motel? Mom doesn't have to know. I just. She stopped herself. I mean, she can know. She doesn't care. I just want to come. Yes, I said. Come whenever you want. I'll always have coffee and I'll buy cookies from the gas station. The gas station has good cookies? The gas station has acceptable cookies, and acceptable is more than enough when the company is right. She made a sound that was essentially a smile translated into sound. Okay, Saturday. Saturday? I said. After we hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my lap and looked at the window and the morning coming through it. Thin October light over the parking lot of the Cloverleaf Motor Inn. And I thought about my granddaughter at 10 years old saying that sounds good about a picture getting bigger. And I thought that this exactly, was why. Not the account, not the 11%. Not the leverage that Margaret Foster was building carefully and precisely into a counterposition that Robert's attorney did not yet see coming. This, a 10-year-old who called at 7:45 on her way to school because she wanted to know if her grandmother was sad. A child who noticed that a 4-leaf clover on a sign had only 3 leaves and had been carrying that small, true observation with her ever since. I was not going to let her grow up watching the women she loved disappear, one quiet surrender at a time. Maisie came on Saturday morning with a backpack over one shoulder and a library book she wanted to show me, and the particular focused energy of a child who has made a decision and is executing it. She sat cross-legged on the end of the motel bed and told me about her week at school with the unself-conscious fullness that children bring to conversation when they are talking to someone they trust completely. I listened the way my father used to listen, present, unhurried, not filling the space between sentences. At some point, she looked up from the library book and said, "Grandma, do you own anything?" The question landed with the precision that only Maisie's questions ever landed, right at the center of the actual thing. Not "are you okay?" Not "what are you going to do?" But, "do you own anything?" "Yes," I said. "Like what?" "Like more than your grandfather knows about." She processed this. She looked at me. "Is that why you're not scared?" I considered the question seriously, because she had asked it seriously. Because she deserved that. "That's part of it," I said. "But mostly I'm not scared, because your great-grandfather spent 30 years making sure I would have something to stand on." I looked at the coat, folded over the chair in the corner. "He just didn't tell me about it until he knew I needed to know." Maisie followed my gaze to the coat. "That's his coat," she said. Not a question. "Yes. How did you know?" She shrugged in the way children shrug when the answer seems obvious to them. "Because you only wear it in the mornings, like you're keeping it for something important." My father's coat, my father's patience, my father's 31 years of quiet work, and his granddaughter's granddaughter, sitting cross-legged on a motel bed at 10 years old, reading a man she had never met in the way he had taught me to read people, by watching what they did quietly when no one was expecting it to mean anything. I reached into my purse. I took out the folded note from the breast pocket. the one I had put back there after the bank, on instinct, because it belonged there. And I held it for a moment. For Nora. The card. When the time is right, I folded it again and put it back. The coat was hanging on the chair. The card was in my wallet. Margaret Foster was doing her work. The picture was getting bigger. The time was not quite right yet, but it was coming. And when it came, I was going to be ready. The morning everything changed was a Thursday. When 31 days since I had carried my suitcase down the front steps, past the roses I had planted and tended for 38 years. Vivian Marsh called at 8:15. Mrs. Cooper, I wanted to let you know. We've had a development in the trust holdings that you'll want to be aware of before your attorney's meeting next week. I set down my gas station coffee. Tell me. Callaway Development Group has filed a preliminary acquisition proposal, she said. A larger regional firm has expressed interest in purchasing a majority stake. It's in the early stages, but if the acquisition proceeds, the minority shareholders would need to be notified, and their holdings would be subject to a buyout offer. I was quiet for a moment. How much time? I said. The preliminary filing suggests a decision window of 60 days. 60 days. Say Robert was in the middle of a divorce proceeding with a woman whose 11% of his company he did not know about. He was in the middle of an acquisition discussion. He was, as far as he understood, negotiating with a wife who had 1 week left on a credit card and the word comfortable to live on. He did not know that the woman he had escorted to the door of her own life was sitting in room 14 of the Cloverleaf Motor Inn with a private banking account, an attorney, and an 11% stake in everything he had built. A stake that, if the acquisition proceeded, would be subject to terms that he would not be able to negotiate without her involvement, whether he wanted to or not. And he did not know any of it. I thanked Vivienne. I hung up. I looked at the window. The October sky was clear and high and cold. Teens my father's voice, quiet and certain. The thing about keeping quiet is you have to make sure you're keeping quiet on purpose. I picked up the phone. I called Margaret Foster. It's time to move, I said. Tell me what to do first. She had been ready for this call. She had been ready, I understood, since the moment she read the holdings document. She walked me through the next steps with the precision of someone who had been quietly assembling things while I had been learning to breathe again. Not rushed, not theatrical, simply clear. The response I was about to give Robert Callaway was not going to look like revenge. It was going to look like what it actually was. A woman who had spent 41 years in a room where someone else controlled the light switches, stepping calmly over to the wall and turning them all on at once. Not because she was angry, because it was time, and because her father, that quiet man with oil on his hands and patience in his eyes, had spent 31 years making absolutely certain that when the time came, the lights would work. Margaret Foster worked the way my father fixed engines, not with noise, not with the kind of motion that announces itself and asks to be watched. She worked quietly, methodically, with the attention of someone who understood that the most important part of any job was not the moment of completion, but the 30 careful steps that made the completion inevitable. In the first week after I told her it was time to move, she filed a formal response to Robert's settlement offer. The response did not yet mention the account or the trust holdings. It simply stated, then in the measured language of someone who has done this for 30 years and knows the value of a measured sentence, that the offer as presented did not reflect the full scope of marital assets, and that my counsel would be requesting complete financial disclosure from both parties before any agreement could be considered. Complete financial disclosure. 4 words that Robert's attorney would read and understand in the way that attorneys understand things, as a signal that someone on the other side of the table knows more than they have shown and is inviting you to wonder how much more. Margaret told me to expect a reaction. She was right. Robert called, not through his attorney, directly, which told me everything about what those 4 words had done to his composure on a Tuesday evening. See, my phone showed his name, and I looked at it for 2 rings, the way Dorothy had taught me, deciding. I answered on the 3rd. Margaret. Not Nora. Not the name he had used for 41 years. My formal name, in the tone of a man who has decided that formality creates distance, and that distance is what he needs right now. Robert. Your attorney filed something today. His voice had the particular quality of controlled irritation, the voice he used in business when something had not gone the way he intended, but he was not yet ready to acknowledge that it had not gone his way. Yes. It's unnecessary. The offer is fair. I'm glad you believe that, I said. My attorney will be in touch. A pause. The pause of a man recalibrating. What are you looking for here, Margaret? His voice shifted. Not warmer, more careful. The voice he used when he was deciding how much to offer. We can do this reasonably. We can be adults. We can be adults. As though the alternative, the one he had already performed, had been a mutual agreement rather than something that had happened to me while I stood in my own kitchen. I am being an adult, Robert, I said. My attorney will be in touch. I ended the call. I sat for a moment in the quiet of room 14 and let the silence settle. Outside, the parking lot lights were coming on in the early dark of November. My father's coat was on the chair. Maisie had left a drawing on the dresser from her Saturday visit. A 4-leaf clover, 4 leaves this time, with my name written underneath in her large, deliberate 10-year-old printing. I looked at the drawing for a while. Then I went to bed and slept better than I had in weeks. The full financial disclosure process takes time. Margaret had prepared me for this. There are forms and requests, and responses to requests, and responses to responses, and at each stage, the attorneys for both sides are reading between the lines of what is being asked, and what is being offered, and what is being withheld, and the whole architecture of it is designed to surface, eventually, a complete picture of what exists. In Robert's case, the complete picture was going to include a surprise. During those weeks, I moved out of the Cloverleaf Motor Inn. I had stayed longer than I needed to. The account gave me options from the moment I left the bank. But there is a particular stubbornness in me that wanted to wait until I was ready to move into something real rather than something temporary. I did not want another interim. I wanted the next place to be a place. I found it on a quiet street 3 miles from the center of Hargrove. A cottage, 1 story, with a front porch that faced west and caught the afternoon light in October in a way that made the whole porch glow amber for about 40 minutes every day around 4 o'clock. It had a back garden, not large, but real, with good soil and a raised bed along the south fence that had clearly been tended at some point and had simply been waiting. I signed the lease with my own name, Eleanor Marie Cooper. I said it clearly to the property manager, and she wrote it down and handed me 2 keys on a small ring, which I put in my purse beside my father's folded note. The first thing I carried through the door was my father's coat. I hung it on the hook inside the front door, where it has been ever since. Dorothy came the first evening with wine and a lasagna, and her particular brand of celebration that involves neither pomp nor excessive sentiment, just presence and good food, and the willingness to sit on a kitchen floor eating from containers when the furniture hasn't arrived yet. We sat on the kitchen floor. We ate lasagna. She toasted my father with her plastic cup of wine and said, "Joseph Cooper, you magnificent quiet man." I said, "Yes." We sat there for a long time. It was the first evening I had spent in a space that was entirely mine, and there is a quality to that kind of evening. The particular quality of a room that has your own silence in it rather than someone else's noise, that I cannot fully describe except to say that it felt like breathing all the way down. The financial disclosure documents arrived at Margaret's office on a Wednesday in late November. She called me that afternoon. "I need you to come in," she said. "There's something you should see." I drove to Clement Street and sat across from her desk and waited. "The disclosure is largely as expected," she began. "The marital assets are substantial. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement accounts, all of it confirms that the original settlement offer was structured to minimize what you received. She set a page on the desk between us. But there is one item in the disclosure that is interesting. I looked at the page. It was a list of Callaway Development's major shareholders, filed as part of the business asset disclosure. Robert had listed himself as the controlling shareholder. He had listed his business partners. He had listed the small institutional holders. And at the bottom, listed as an unnamed trust, because that was how my father had structured it, and because Robert's attorney had apparently done exactly what Vivian Marsh had predicted, and had searched the standard shareholder records without finding the beneficial owner, was an entry for an 11% trust holding. Robert's attorney had listed it as unknown beneficial owner, under investigation. Under investigation. They knew it existed. They could see the stake in their own filings. They could not see who held it. I looked at Margaret. He's been trying to find out who owns that 11%, she said. For the disclosure, he needs to account for it. His attorneys have been searching for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of his attorneys searching for the beneficial owner of the stake that had been sitting in his own company since before he built it into what it was. 3 weeks of searching for a name that was, at that moment, sitting across from Margaret Foster in a dark wool coat, holding a cup of tea with both hands. "When do we tell him?" I said. Margaret leaned back slightly. "The acquisition offer," she said. "That's when." She explained it to me the way she explained everything. Clearly, without drama, with the economy of someone who has been in serious rooms long enough to know that the sentences that matter most are the short ones. The acquisition offer from the regional firm was formal now. A hearing date had been set for all stakeholders, in a law office in Hargrove, in front of representatives from both companies, all shareholders, and the attorneys involved, for the 3rd week of December. Every stakeholder with a holding above 5% was required to be present or represented. 11% cleared that threshold by a considerable margin. Robert would walk into that room expecting to conduct a business transaction and a divorce settlement simultaneously, believing the major unknowns were being resolved in his favor. He would be the CEO of the company under discussion. He would be the majority shareholder. He would be the man whose name was on everything. He would not know that the unnamed trust with 11%, the one his attorneys had been searching for, was going to walk through the door, not as his ex-wife, not as the woman he had handed the word comfortable and ushered to the door, as Eleanor Marie Cooper, stakeholder. "He'll see me the moment I come in," I said. "Yes," Margaret said. "That is precisely the point." December arrived and brought with it the particular cold of a Tennessee winter that makes the air feel clean and exact, like the year is being organized before it ends. I spent those weeks settling into the cottage. I planted bulbs in the raised bed along the south fence, tulips and daffodils, things that require patience, things that would not show themselves until spring. I began a new garden journal. The first entry was 3 lines. December 4th. New bed. Good soil. Start from here. Maisie came every Saturday now. It had become the shape of our week. She would arrive with her backpack, and sometimes a friend, and sometimes just herself, and we would sit at my kitchen table and drink cocoa, and she would tell me about school, and I would tell her about the garden, and there was a quality to those mornings that I understood, without quite having words for it at the time, was what I had been trying to build back toward. Kevin called more often now, still not fully there, still hedging, still careful, still carrying a guilt he had not yet found the vocabulary to properly name. But the calls were real, and they were longer. And in one of them, he said something that I wrote down in the garden journal, because it seemed like the kind of sentence worth keeping. "I think I understood the company better than I understood my own family. I don't know when that happened." I told him that was an honest thing to say. I told him that honest things said out loud were the only place a repair could start. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, are you going to be okay?" And I told him the truth. I already am. He didn't fully understand that yet. He would, soon enough. The stakeholder hearing was held on a Tuesday, the 17th of December, at the offices of Whitmore and Associates on the fourth floor of the Hargrove Commerce Building. Margaret and I arrived 8 minutes early, which she had advised. And not first. She did not want the entrance to look orchestrated, but before the full room assembled. We took our seats at the long conference table. Margaret set her folder down. I set my hands in my lap. I wore a deep blue dress and my good earrings, the pearl drops my mother had left me, and my posture was the posture of someone who is entirely comfortable in the room they are sitting in, which is a thing the body can perform even before it is fully true, and which becomes true through the performing. I had not told Kevin I would be there. I had not told anyone except Margaret and Dorothy. Robert arrived at 9:55, 5 minutes before the scheduled 10 o'clock start, with his attorney beside him and the confident stride of a man who has arrived at a room he believes belongs to him. See, he was wearing the dark blue suit, the same one he wore for important events. He had Linda Proctor on his other side, which I noted and then did not note again, because she had already become a detail in a story I was no longer telling about myself. He saw me at the table before he reached his seat. He stopped. Not theatrically, just the particular stop of a person whose body has received information that the mind has not yet processed. One full step, and then stillness. I looked at him the way my father had taught me to look at things that required looking at directly, without flinching, without performance, without the apologetic half-glance of someone who has decided in advance that they might be in the wrong place. I was not in the wrong place. Robert's attorney touched his elbow, and they moved to their seats. Robert sat. He said something to his attorney, low and quick, and I saw his attorney's expression perform the same careful adjustments that Vivian Marsh's had in the bank office, the adjustments of a professional receiving information that required recategorizing. His attorney glanced at my folder. At the name on the tab, at Eleanor Marie Cooper. I watched the attorney look at the name. I watched the attorney look at the table's seating chart. I watched the attorney's expression arrive at the conclusion that the unnamed trust, the one they had been searching for, the one filed in the disclosure as unknown beneficial owner, under investigation, was sitting across the table in a blue dress and pearl earrings. The attorney leaned toward Robert and said something. Robert's face did not change. That was what surprised me. Not a flush, not a recoil, not the dramatic collapse of certainty I might have imagined during those weeks in the motel room. Just a stillness. The stillness of a man receiving information that was too large to process in public, and who was therefore processing nothing, purchasing time through the appearance of composure. It was the most honest expression I had seen on his face in years. The hearing was called to order by a senior representative from Whitmore and Associates, a measured gray-haired man named Aldridge, who had conducted enough of these proceedings to have reduced the format to its essential structure. He went through the agenda. He confirmed the acquisition proposal from the regional firm. He confirmed the requirement for all major stakeholders to declare their positions. When he reached the 11% trust holding, he looked up from his papers. I understand the beneficial owner of this holding has been identified and is present. He looked at Margaret. Counsel? Margaret stood. Yes. The beneficial owner of the trust holding is my client, Eleanor Marie Cooper, present at this table. She gestured to me without flourish. Ms. Cooper is also the respondent in the associated divorce proceedings currently before the Hargrove County Family Court. A short silence. The kind of silence that is the sound of a room adjusting. Aldridge nodded. He made a note. He moved to the next item on the agenda. But across the table, Robert had stopped being still. He was looking at me. Not with anger, not yet, or not only. With something that took me a moment to name, and that I would not have been able to name without 41 years of knowing his face. He was looking at me with the expression of a man who has just understood that he has been moving through a story he thought he was the author of, and has discovered, in front of witnesses, that he was not. Linda Proctor, beside him, had understood something too. She had understood it slightly faster than Robert, possibly, because she had come into this marriage without the same certainty of ownership. She was looking at me with the expression of someone calculating, rapidly, what this meant. Not grief, not recognition, simple arithmetic. Kevin arrived 20 minutes into the hearing. He had been asked to attend as operations manager of Callaway Development. He came through the door with his coat still on and his briefcase in his hand, already apologizing to the room for the delay. His eyes moving across the table to find his father, and then finding me. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. His briefcase was still in his hand. The room had paused in the way rooms pause when something has entered them that requires adjustment. "Mom," he said. Just the word. No sentence around it. "Sit down, Kevin," I said gently. "They've already started." He sat. He sat in the nearest available chair and looked at me, and then at the nameplate in front of me, and then at Margaret, and then back at me, and I watched him understand it. Not all at once, but in the incremental way that understanding actually arrives when the thing being understood is large enough to require more than one moment. I watched my son understand what I held. I watched him understand what I had not held for 41 years. High because no one had thought to ask. He did not look away from me. He sat with it. When the stakeholder hearing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. During those 2 hours and 40 minutes, the acquisition proposal was reviewed in full. The terms were assessed. The attorneys for both companies spoke. Questions were asked and answered. And at every point where the 11% required acknowledgement, where Aldridge turned to my side of the table, where documents were reviewed that required the beneficial owner's input, where the regional firm's representative addressed the major stakeholders. Eleanor Marie Cooper was addressed by name, with the particular deference that a room reserves for someone who holds something real. Not Robert's ex-wife. Not my Nora. Not the woman who had been given the word comfortable and shown the door. A stakeholder. A person with a position in the room that the room had not created and could not rescind. When the hearing concluded, Aldridge summarized the next steps. Both parties would review the acquisition proposal and communicate their positions within 30 days. The divorce proceedings, he noted, would incorporate the identified assets appropriately. I thanked him. Margaret closed her folder. We stood. Robert stood across the table. Linda Proctor was already speaking to his attorney in a low, quick voice that had shed its warmth entirely. The voice, I understood, of someone who has been pleasant for instrumental reasons and no longer requires the performance. Robert came around the table. He stood in front of me. His attorney had the wisdom to step back. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We were standing in a conference room in Hargrove, Tennessee, 43 years after the summer party, where I had thought, here is a man who knows exactly who he is. We were standing in the aftermath of 41 years of a marriage, and a morning in October, when he had closed a front door behind me without looking back. I looked at him clearly. The way you look at something when you have finally stopped apologizing for seeing it. "You should have told me," he said. His voice was quiet. Not angry. Something flatter. The voice of a man sitting with a truth he would rather not be sitting with. "You're right," I said. "I should have told you 41 years ago that my name meant something. That was my mistake." I held his gaze. "Shui, the rest of the mistakes are yours." He had nothing to say to that. Kevin had come to stand a few feet away, not inserting himself, just present in the way of someone who has decided that the least they can do is be a witness to the thing they were not present enough to prevent. I looked at my son. "Walk me out?" He said yes. He said it immediately, the way he used to say yes when he was small, and I asked him to come help me in the garden. We stood on the sidewalk outside the Commerce Building in the December cold. Kevin had his coat on now. He was looking at the street rather than at me, the way he had always looked at things he was thinking about hard. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About 6 weeks?" He nodded slowly. "And you didn't say anything?" "No?" A pause. "Because of the divorce proceedings?" Partly, I said, and partly because I needed to understand what I had before I decided what to do with it. He looked at me then. Mom, He stopped, started again. I didn't know about the trust, about any of it. I know you didn't. But I should have. I should have been paying more attention. To you, to what was happening to you. He pressed his hands together in the cold. The same gesture he had made in the boardroom. The same gesture he had made at 11 years old when he was sitting with something he couldn't undo. Patrice and I talked, a lot, in the last few weeks, about how things have been. He looked at the street again. She's not proud of herself either. She told me to tell you that. I heard that. I let it settle. Kevin, I said, what I need from you is not a summary of the conversations you've had about me. What I need is for you to show up, not once, not dramatically, just consistently. The way your grandfather showed up for me, quietly, for 31 years, without ever asking me to notice. He was quiet for a long moment. I can do that, he said. I know you can, I said. That's why I'm telling you. He walked me to my car. He held the door. It was a small thing, and it was the right thing, and he did it without being asked, which is the only way that small right things count. The divorce settlement was finalized in February. Margaret Foster had done her work completely, which is the word she had used, and I understood now what it meant. The final settlement reflected the full scope of 41 years of marriage. The house, the one with the roses I had planted and tended and left blooming in October, was sold, and my share of the proceeds was real. The investment accounts were divided with the attention that a complete financial picture demands. The retirement accounts were split appropriately. The 11% stake in Callaway Development was not part of the divorce settlement. It had never been a marital asset. It had been mine, in my name, in my trust, held for me by my father, since before Robert and I had signed a single document together. It remained mine when the settlement was signed. I chose to sell it. Not because Robert asked. He did not ask. He knew better by then than to ask. I sold it because the acquisition proceeded, and the regional firm's buyout offer for the minority holdings was fair, and because I understood, in the quiet way that understanding sometimes arrives, that what my father had given me was not the stake itself. The stake was the mechanism. What he had given me was the room to stand in, the knowledge that I could. The proof arrived at exactly when I needed it, that I had never been as small in the world as the world had come to treat me. The sale closed on a Thursday in March. The funds transferred to Eleanor Marie Cooper. Vivian Marsh called to confirm. Congratulations, Mrs. Cooper, she said. Thank you, Vivian, I said. And please thank whoever it was at this bank who held that account for 12 years waiting for me to come through the door. A brief warmth in her voice. Your father was very specific about the instructions. He said, if she comes in looking like she's had a hard time of it, make sure she knows right away that she has something to stand on. A pause. I hope we did that. You did, I said. Exactly that. By spring, my life had taken on the shape I had not known I was building toward. The cottage on the quiet street, with the west-facing porch and the garden along the south fence. The bulbs I had planted in December came up in March. Daffodils first, then the tulips, yellow and cream, and one deep red that I had not remembered choosing, and that delighted me precisely because of it. I started a new section of the raised bed for tomatoes, Cherokee purples, and a few sunolds for the color, the way I had always planted them, the way my mother had taught me, the way I had planted them every spring for 30 years before I stopped. I did not stop anymore. Yes, Dorothy came on Friday mornings. We sat on the west porch with coffee when the weather allowed, and in the kitchen when it did not. And we talked for 2 hours the way we had been talking for 30 years. About everything, about nothing, about the particular quality of the light on a March morning in Tennessee that makes you feel like the world is clearing its throat and preparing to say something important. Kevin came on Sundays for dinner. Not every Sunday. Some Sundays he had his own life, which was as it should be, and I was glad of it rather than diminished by it. But the Sundays he came, he sat at my kitchen table and ate my cooking and told me about his week, and we had the kind of conversation that had been unavailable between us for years, the kind that requires both people to be present without the armor of their respective certainties. He was learning, slowly, with the particular humility of someone who has understood, genuinely, and not just as a performance of understanding, that there are things they did not see that they should have. It was not a finished thing. It was a beginning thing, which is the only kind worth having. Patrice sent a letter in March. Not a phone call. A letter, handwritten, 3 pages, which told me she understood the weight of what she had chosen to write and was not willing to give it the casualness of a text or an email. She said she had not known the full shape of what had happened in that house. To me, to the space I was allowed to occupy in my own marriage and family, until she looked at it from outside. She said she had been thoughtless. She said thoughtless was not innocent, and she was not asking me to treat it as such. She said she hoped, in time, I would be willing to try. I have her letter in my garden journal. I have not yet replied. I will. I am deciding what to say, which is different from not knowing what to say. Maisie comes every Saturday, which is still the truest fact of my week. She has taken over one section of the raised bed. She decided, without asking permission, that she would plant sunflowers along the east edge, which I told her might shade the tomatoes, and she said the tomatoes could adjust, which made me laugh so hard I had to set down my trowel. She has the particular certainty of someone who has not yet been taught to apologize for knowing what she wants, and I am determined that she will keep it longer than I kept mine. She knows what happened. Not all of it. Not the legal details. Not the numbers. Not the full story of the coat and the card and the motel room. But she knows the essential shape of it, because she is 10 years old, and she asks direct questions, and she deserves direct answers. She knows her grandfather underestimated her grandmother. She knows her great-great-grandfather spent 31 years making sure that when it mattered, her grandmother would have something to stand on. She knows that quietly doing right by someone is its own kind of love, maybe the most durable kind, the kind that outlasts the person giving it. She knows, because I told her, that the coat is on the hook inside my front door. She asked once if she could try it on. I said yes. So she put it on, and it was enormous on her, the shoulders hanging halfway to her elbows, the hem brushing the floor. She stood in my front hallway in my father's charcoal wool coat and looked at herself in the hall mirror with the solemn concentration of a child performing an important ceremony. "He was big," she said. "He was," I said, "in all the ways that matter." She took it off carefully and hung it back on the hook, exactly where it had been. She smoothed the collar. "I'm glad you didn't donate it," she said. "So am I, Maisie," I said. "So am I." I go back to the park on Alderman Street sometimes. Not every morning. I have the porch now and the garden, and the particular quality of a Tuesday morning in my own kitchen, with my own coffee and my own silence. Which is worth more to me than I have adequate words for. But sometimes, on the mornings when I want to think about something big, I drive to Alderman Street and sit on the bench near the fountain. It is the same park I walked through during those early November mornings in my father's coat, in the weeks when I was still in room 14 and still figuring out the shape of what I held. I have sat on that bench in the cold and in the early spring, and I have thought about my father, and about what it means to prepare something for someone you love, quietly, without ever telling them, trusting that when the time comes, they will find it. I think about room 14 and the garbage bag, and the coat I was going to donate in the morning. I think about how close I came to carrying it to the bin before I felt the weight of the pocket. I think about the 8 words in his handwriting, for Nora, the card, when the time is right. He had been keeping quiet on purpose. He had been watching and working and trusting me to need it when I needed it, and to find it when I was ready to find it. I try to be worthy of that. Not the money, I have made the account do what he intended, which was to give me options, which I have used to build a life that is entirely and unambiguously mine. Not the 11%. That is gone now, spent in the way that things meant to be spent should be spent, purposefully and without regret. What I try to be worthy of is the patience, the faith, the willingness to do the right thing quietly for 31 years, without requiring anyone to see it. My father was not a wealthy man in the visible sense. He was a mechanic with oil on his hands and clean, clear eyes. He sat on his porch in the evenings and watched the sunset and told me, near the end, that keeping quiet was only a virtue if it was a choice. He had been choosing, for decades, on purpose. The day I walked into First National Bank, with his card and my own name and nothing else in my purse, but 31 years of his patience, that was the day I finally understood what he had been keeping quiet about. Not just an account, not just a trust, not just the shares in a company or the zeros on a screen. He had been keeping quiet about me, about what he believed I was worth, about the size of the thing he saw in me that the people around me had learned, over the years, not to look at. He saw it. He kept it. He handed it back to me in the pocket of a coat I almost donated on the way out of my own life. Joseph Harlan Cooper, a man who fixed engines and watered roses and said what mattered in 8 words. For Nora, the card. When the time is right. Thank you, Dad. It was. I am writing this from my porch. It is April, and the westlight is doing its thing, that amber 40 minutes before the sun goes below the roofline that makes everything look like it has been preserved in something valuable. The daffodils are finished now, but the tulips are still going. The deep red one especially, which has outlasted the others by 2 weeks and shows no particular sign of stopping. My coffee is warm. My garden journal is open to a new page. Maisie will be here Saturday. She is planning to expand the sunflower section, which will definitely shade the tomatoes, and I have already decided to let her. Dorothy is coming tomorrow. The library called this week to ask if I would consider returning as a volunteer on the 2nd and 4th Thursday. I said yes. I'm already thinking about what to say to the children who come in looking for their first chapter books, what it takes to match the right story to the right reader at the right moment. You develop an instinct for it. You learn to see the person behind the question. My father taught me that. Not about books, about people, about the value of looking at what is actually there, rather than at what is convenient to see. I set my coffee down. I pick up my pen. I look out at the garden, at the coat on the hook inside the door. I'm visible through the front window from where I sit. At the 4-leaf clover drawing on my kitchen wall, 4 leaves this time, every one of them there, with my name in Maisie's large, deliberate letters underneath. At the new page of the garden journal, blank and waiting, I write 3 words at the top. Everything from here. Yes, thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.